morning, good afternoon, good evening. There is no way we as South Africans can stop Africans from coming to South Africa. No way. I don't care how many electric fences we build, said the former South African president, Thabo Mbeki. This is a sweeping statement that certainly cannot be allowed to go unchallenged. Former President Thabo Mbeki could and should have helped to stop the late Zanu PF dictator Robert Gabriel Mugabe destroying Zimbabwe. That would have stopped the flood of economic and political refugees from Zimbabwe into South Africa and many other countries in the region and beyond. That is a historic fact. Let's just hear what he had to say on the subject.
And there's a particular sentiment towards South Africa from the continent. A sense of ownership, of belonging. And you can't change it. It's right through the continent. South Africa belongs to all of us. It's our thing. And of course, it's more developed and all of this and the other thing. There is no way we as South Africans are going to stop Africans coming to South Africa. No way. I don't care how many electrical fences you build. It's going to happen. So the challenge we face as South Africans is to how do we deal with that? You can't keep these fellow Africans out of South Africa, and you can't define our relationship with South Africa versus the other Africans as enemies. These are our enemies who've come to our country to take our jobs and all of that. They will come. I'm saying I don't care how many electrical fences you build. With the challenge we face, what is it that we do in order to respond to that problem? You know, there was this issue was discussed in KZN.
The truth of the matter is, during his time as president, Zimbabwe was already in a mess by the time he came into power. True enough. But in 2007 to 2008, he was involved in trying to address the problem. The problem in Zimbabwe was simple, a political problem. We had a regime, a Zanu PF dictatorship, whose leaders had always believed that they have the divine right to rule the country. That was at the heart of the problem and still is to this day. South Africa played a role, credit where credit is due, in forcing the Zanu PF regime to accept a number of important electoral reforms run up to the 2008 elections. And so Zimbabwe's 2008 elections were the nearest the country had ever got to holding free, fair, and credible elections. And as the results started trickling in, and Zanu PF leaders realized that the party was losing, the likes of Mnangagwa and Chiwenga stepped in, stopped SEC declaring the results, and they went on to spend the next 5 to 6 weeks recounting 5 million votes. The opposition had a majority in parliament, a very thin majority in parliament. But most significantly, Morgan Tsvangirai's majority votes in the presidential race were whittled down to 47%, enough to force the runoff. During the runoff, the country was subjected to the worst election-related violence the country had ever seen. Here is Dr. Ibo Mandaza describing what happened that year.
I also know that Mugabe conceded defeat on 2008. He phoned Mbeki and Obasanjo to concede defeat. I hope that Thabo Mbeki and Obasanjo will one day make that public. But one of them, I won't say which one, told me that Mugabe phoned them that Saturday night and said, look, I lost the election and I concede defeat. And I know that Mugabe stuck to his guns. I was prepared to go. His wife was since bags packed to go somewhere on the following day when Mnangagwa and Chiwenga approached him and said, you stay where you are. And then they contrived the runoff, sadly with the help of South Africa. And runoff took place, very violent. 360 people were killed. I don't know. The South African, I came here as part of a delegation to Cape Town to see members of the ANC. I don't want to mention names, they're my friends. I saw them, and through them, a cabinet committee subcommittee of South African cabinet was set up on the Zimbabwe issue. It was on the basis of that cabinet committee that South Africa did not recognize the runoff. And indeed, it was the basis of that committee that Thabo sent the generals to South Africa, to Zimbabwe. I met them, and I was one of the few to have read the report, because I was flying to Joburg in the company of General Romano, who was a friend. He passed away, no? That's why, yeah. And I also took people who had lost their hands in the violence to the South African embassy in Harare. And Romano broke down in tears. How can a liberation movement treat these people like that? He was a broken man. So there's no doubt at all here in South Africa as to the brutality of the regime in Harare. So it amazes me, it angers me, in fact, when I hear the nonsense coming out of people like Mbalula's mouth. They know it. And the report has never been published, the general's report, to this day. That tells you. Is it complicit behavior? I don't know. But to get back to 2008, the runoff took place. Mugabe was sworn in at midnight before boarding a plane with Mbeki to Sharm el-Sheikh. Ambassador, I forgot to mention that. Yes?
There is no doubt about it that South Africa, as the most powerful nation in SADC, could have played a more positive role. For the record, it must be said that by refusing to recognize Zanu PF and forcing that regime to go into the GNU, South Africa and SADC gave Zimbabwe a golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms, which, if done, would have put the country back on a democratic footing. We failed to implement even one token reform. While the opposition would want to blame SADC, the truth of the matter is Mugabe bribed Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends, and they forgot about the reforms. But still, we cannot deny that South Africa, President Mbeki himself, swore in Zimbabwe failing to resolve itself is anything to be proud of. At the time when President Mbeki was asked about the Zimbabwe crisis, he infamously said, "Crisis? What crisis?" That said it all. It is most unfortunate that the economic collapse in Zimbabwe has created an economic and political problem for South Africa. The millions of Zimbabweans who have had to seek political and economic refuge in South Africa, yes, many of them have contributed to the economic well-being of that country, but there is no denying that many others would become a burden. And let me state it as well, that if Zimbabwe had been well run and it maintained its economic growth and prosperity at the level we had in 1980, it would have benefited South Africa too. Because the two countries' economic growth would have fed each other. And there is no doubt also that by allowing Zimbabwe to become a corrupt nation, that has not helped South Africa. Corruption in South Africa is there for everyone to see. There is no doubt that a corrupt South Africa and a corrupt Zimbabwe started feeding on each other. Some of the people who were involved in corruption in South Africa found it easy to continue doing their business in Zimbabwe and vice versa. So the economic collapse of Zimbabwe could have been prevented if the likes of former President Mbeki had had the vision to realize that an economically prosperous Zimbabwe and politically stable Zimbabwe was, in the long run, to the benefit of South Africa itself. One of the problems that ANC has had is that they have looked at Zanu PF as a fellow liberation movement. And they looked at if Zanu PF was to be removed from office, could that also happen in South Africa? And there is no doubt that has helped South Africa's leaders, including former President Thabo Mbeki himself, to turn a blind eye to Robert Mugabe's Zanu PF, tyrannical, corrupt, and ruthless dictatorship. That is the truth. So to say that there's nothing that South Africa could do to stop the flood of Zimbabweans to South Africa is nonsense. Thabo Mbeki, President Thabo Mbeki himself, could have done a lot more to end the madness in Zimbabwe. He still has a lot of information about Zimbabwe, which I think he owes it to himself and posterity to bring out in the open. The report that Professor Ibo Mandasa was talking about there should be made public. Who is it benefiting to keep it a secret? The only people who are benefiting from it are the Zanu PF thugs. One of the tragedies that we have in Zimbabwe is that the two men who orchestrated the Operation Mafotera Papi in 2008, Nangagwa and Chwenga, were later on to collaborate again in the military coup of 2017. And at the end of it, they occupied the offices of president and vice president, respectively. Those two men should have gone to jail for what they did in 2008. Not to State House. Think about it. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.